changes over time. I found this to be interesting. You can't have advertising for cigarettes anymore, especially it's prohibited on TV and very limited on print advertising, but there was a time where more doctors smoked Camels than any other cigarette, and they endorsed them. And nowadays, not only will you not see the advertising, I feel certain that very few, if any, doctors would advocate it. There was another advertisement from a dentist, and they talked about how this brand was so soothing for your throat and pleasant to work on patients that smoked this brand because it was soothing. But time changes. This fact was not true for Ruth and Naomi. The fact that there was change, but it wasn't positive change. Their lives had changed, but it was not positive. They had neither the power nor the resources to change it. They had their lot, and that was it. But they didn't realize the change, the ultimate change that the Almighty had in store for them. Chapter 1 ends with the author, and I use the word author. We really don't know who wrote the book of Ruth. Most people believe it was Samuel, but we don't know for certain. But chapter 1 ends with the author indicating that Ruth and Naomi had returned. They'd returned to Bethlehem during the barley harvest. And that's seemingly an insignificant fact, but it turns out to be very important. The season of the harvest was a time for celebration. It was a time of happiness, rejoicing to God for what He has blessed His creation with, a bountiful harvest. Ruth and Naomi's ability to feed themselves, unfortunately, would rely on the inefficiency of the harvesters, what they left behind. The more efficient they were at harvesting, the less that was left behind. So the narrative in this story is kind of tied to this pattern. These women returned to Bethlehem during the barley harvest. They return home in time for God's favor, but they don't yet recognize it and realize it, and for a fruitful restoration of Naomi, but she's not there yet. The skill of the author in this case, obviously inspired, and again, most believe it was Samuel that wrote this book, but we don't know for certain. But he introduces this story, this meeting that's going to occur here in the barley harvest. And that's when we get into chapter 2, and chapter 2 opens with an additional bit of background information. Last week we learned in chapter 2, verse 1, that Naomi had a in-law. Many think it was a nephew, but Naomi had a relative named Boaz. He was a man of considerable wealth, and he had a great reputation. He's been described in some versions as a man of standing or a mighty man of wealth. The Hebrew words from which it's translated is literally a mighty man of valor. But he is of great reputation. Everybody knows him. Everybody likes him. He's a very fair and honest man. This man of valor is the same word used in Judges chapter 11 to refer to Jephthah. He was a man of valor. He was a valiant warrior. Well, that's the word that describes Boaz. His name is actually translated, in him is strength or fleetness. His name's on the first or the north or the left pillar in the temple that Solomon built. You can find that in 1 Kings chapter 7. It's in complete contrast to Naomi, who now says, "My name is bitter," or Mara. Certainly, he's a man of many virtues, and we're going to see that play out. We're going to see that how he was an upstanding man. He could have taken complete advantage of this situation, but he didn't. So he is this close relative or a redeemer. Some versions call it a guardian redeemer. Some versions call it a kinsman redeemer. But he is the one who can redeem property for a relative who dies. The author already knows what's ahead. He kind of gives us a hint of this description in describing Boaz as a relative, and after this natural kindness that he's going to show, he appeals to the kindness of Ruth. They're both exhibiting kindness. And Naomi's kind of in the middle here, the recipient of this kindness. So there's no claims that are being made. There's no appeal to customs. There's no attempt to fast track all this. Naomi is, she's willing to wait and let this play out. But as we saw last week also, that Ruth is full of I guess ties to the Old Testament, the Old Law, and how things play out. For instance, the Old Testament had provisions for the very poor. If you look in Leviticus chapter 19 and chapter 23, during the harvest period, a farmer was prohibited from harvesting to the outside edges of the field, and also they were prohibited from harvesting a second time. Once the harvesters went through and what they left behind, they couldn't go back and get it. Oh, we missed some. They had to leave it. That's for the poor. That was for the foreigners. That's for those who couldn't provide for themselves. God made provisions for that in the law. Those who were left could go in and through the process called gleaning, they would be able to keep for themselves what they could get. Ruth, as the younger of the two women, volunteers to go out into the field and collect and glean and collect this grain that they desperately needed. The NIV uses the phrase, or I think it's the NIV, uses the phrase, as it turned out. It just so happened that Ruth picked the field to go to. She could have picked a number of fields, but she picked the field to go to, the field of Boaz. And verse 3 of chapter 2 makes it clear that Ruth was unaware of the significance. It just says she went out and entered the field, and as it turned out, she was working in the field belonging to Boaz. So there was no understanding that he's a relative of Naomi and Elimelech's family. Didn't know that he was a redeemer of Elimelech's family. She was completely unaware of it. As it turned out, she picked the right field. Obviously, God is at work here. But not only was God at work here, Ruth's initiative seems to be to keep her and Naomi alive. But I think there's a deeper emphasis anyway than that. As a poor people, Ruth and Naomi need help. But much more is about to come their way, but it has to be a lesson of faith now. This almost mournful request in verse 2 of chapter 2, where Ruth is almost mournfully saying that, I just want to go glean anywhere. Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I can find favor, or I find favor. In other words, we need help. We need help right now, and I can go find someone to help us. And as it turned out, She went to the right field. So in chapter 2, verses 4 through 17, this first meeting of Ruth and Boaz plays out. Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, and he greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of the harvesters, "Who does that woman belong to?" Referring to Ruth. "She's the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field, and she remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field. Don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jugs the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother and your homeland, and you came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done, and may you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of any of your other servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread, and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain, and she ate all that she wanted and had some left over. And as she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves, and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening, and she threshed the barley she had gathered. And she had gathered what amounted to be about an ephah. So when Boaz comes to inspect his laborers, he notices this young woman. And upon inquiry, he finds out that she is the Moabitess that accompanied Naomi back from the land of Moab to Bethlehem. And the author reminds us of Ruth's nationality 6 times in this section. It was obviously integral to his message. And Boaz addresses Ruth directly in verse 8. And he takes actions to provide for her safety and the well-being during the workday. That was a very dangerous place to go into some fields. You know, he told the harvesters, "Leave her alone. Do not touch her." I think even Naomi had said, "You be careful. It's a very dangerous place." And it was a very dangerous place in some of these fields. And it's quite possible that his form of address in verse 9, "my daughter," it's quite possible that reflects a disparity in their ages. It's quite possible that Boaz was much older than Ruth. It's the same phrase used by Naomi in verse 2 to refer to Ruth, and we know there was a discrepancy in their ages. But he wants to make sure she's taken care of. He wants to make sure she's safe. He wants to make sure she's blessed because of what she's done to bless Naomi. So this will provide her with a more favorable position than the other gleaners, and would ensure her success. And you notice he says, "Have a drink from the jugs that the men filled." And I think this is important also, because it was customary in their culture for the women to gather water. You know, Jesus met the woman at the well. Rebekah, the future wife of Isaac, was first contacted by Abraham's servant at a well when she had come out to gather water. In Genesis chapter 24, he had the camels kneel down near the well outside of the town, and it was toward evening, the time that the women were to go out and draw water. The water in these jugs were for the harvesters. And if you notice when she eats, in verse 14, she sat down with the harvesters. So we don't know the full context, but it appears he has integrated her in among the harvesters and given her this favored position. The other gleaners, the other foreigners, the other poor that were gleaning, they weren't given this opportunity. But she was. The water was for the men. The men had gathered it. It wasn't for the gleaners. They were responsible for their own. It wasn't for the foreigners or the widows or the poor. And then Ruth asks, why have I found such favor? Why are you being so nice to me? In other words. And Boaz says, well, I know who you are and I know what you've done. And so her expression of gratitude and bewilderment, why are you doing this? I don't. This is unexpected. This is undeserved. This is unbelievable to me. But her bewilderment is basically trumped by Boaz's explanation that he was aware of the personal sorrow and misfortune that she had faced, but what she had done for Naomi, that was what he thought deserved to be, for her to be blessed because of that. So Boaz concludes with a brief prayerful thought that God would honor her faithfulness, verse 12. But little did Boaz know that he would be God's instrument in answering this prayer. Ruth responds with great humility and gratitude, acknowledging that his kindness had comforted her. Verse 13, her words, speaking kindly to, I believe that's what the NIV translates there. That's the New Living Translation also uses speaking kindly to. That's really not the best translation. It's unfortunate that sometimes these true expressions get lost in the English translation. The literal translation there is spoken to the heart of. Spoken to the heart of. In other words, what you've done is spoken to my heart, is what Ruth is telling him. You have touched me. Not only have you blessed me, you have touched me with your kindness. You're speaking to my heart. After being widowed and leaving her home country, living in acute poverty, her encounter with Boaz was the turning point in her life. So after lunch, his kindness didn't stop there. He gives her extra food at mealtime. And after lunch, he makes provisions for her to not only have more than the leftover sheaves, but if she kind of strays and gets into the other parts of the field that haven't been harvested yet, don't scold her for that. Even pull up some sheaves and just leave them laying there so she can pick them up too. He was intentionally blessing her because of the kindness he had shown to one of his relatives. And the result for her day was an ephah, which is about equivalent to a bushel, around 35 liters if you're into that metric stuff, but it's about a bushel. That's pretty impressive for a gleaner. But she had a little extra help. Verse 18, chapter 2. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. That's from her lunch. Her mother-in-law asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." And she added, "This man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work with him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. After seeing Ruth's, the product of her work that day, an ephah of barley, her leftovers from lunch, Naomi was anxious to know who was the human source of these blessings. And when she understood in verse 20 that it was a close relative, Boaz, who was responsible, she broke out in praise to God. She's so thankful that not only has Ruth been able to be successful, but they've all been blessed by the kindness of a relative. I don't think she quite yet understands that God is the one, the moving force behind all this, but she will in the end. But she's just so thankful for the blessings of that day. It seems to be that her attitude is beginning to change, that it's beginning to improve, and that what she had left behind, the bitterness of Mara, is beginning to again translate back to pleasant Naomi. But she's not there yet. Boaz is identified as a guardian redeemer, which is some versions, but kinsman redeemer is what I prefer. They're kin, and it's their duty to redeem. They're not a guardian in the legal sense, if that makes sense. But this designation used for the kinsman, he was the one responsible for, among other things, ensuring family property. In Israelite society, all real property belonged ultimately to God. It was not possible legally to purchase another family's land permanently. In hard times, one could sell their land temporarily. It's kind of a sort of a lease, really, the way it worked out, but they could temporarily sell it. But in Leviticus chapter 25, God tells Moses that every 50th year, the year of Jubilee, that's when the property returned to the rightful clan. Leviticus chapter 25, beginning in verse 11, 50th year will be a year of Jubilee for you. Do not sow, do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the untended vines. It is a Jubilee, and it is to be holy for you. Eat only what is taken directly from the fields. In the year of Jubilee, everyone is to return to their own property. If you sell land to any of your own people and you buy it from them, do not take advantage of each other. You are to buy from your own people on the basis of the number of years since the last Jubilee, and you sell on the basis of the number of years left for harvesting crops. So when the years are many, you increase the price, and when the years are few, you decrease the price, because what is really being sold to you is the number of crops. Do not take advantage of each other, but fear your God. I am the Lord your God. Further on down in Leviticus 25, the land must not be sold permanently. This is God telling this to Moses. The land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land that you hold a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. If, however, there is no one to redeem it for them, but later on they prosper and acquire sufficient means to redeem it themselves, they are to determine the value for the years since they sold it and refund the balance to the one to whom they sold it. Then they can go back to their own property. But if they do not acquire the means to repay, what was sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee, and then it will be returned in the Jubilee so they can go back to their property. So Boaz is this redeemer. It's his job to make sure that this property stays within their family, within their clan. The law of Moses allowed a woman to request this redemption. It could take place in various forms and contexts, but that's the key to the book of Ruth. An example of this principle of redemption, a bad example, is in 1 Kings chapter 21 when King Ahab wanted Naboth's vineyard, and he offered to buy it, but Naboth would not sell it because he couldn't sell it outside of his family, his clan. He said, no, I can't do that. I won't do that. I won't sell it outside of my family. And so, unfortunately for him, King Ahab and his wife Jezebel, mainly her, devised a scheme, a plan to murder Naboth and seize his property. But that is the principle that he was referring to here, is even if I wanted to sell it to you, I won't, I can't, because it belongs in our family. It must stay in our family. It must stay in our clan. This responsibility kind of naturally merged with the institution of the heirship marriage, where the Redeemer would marry his dead brother's widow if she was childless. And in chapter 1, verse 11, Naomi probably was referring to the Old Testament practice of this heirship marriage. The brother of a deceased and childless man marries the widow to raise up an heir for the deceased. Again, there's provisions in the law. Deuteronomy chapter 25, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that the name will not be blotted out from Israel. Not only that is the idea of heirship, but it's also the idea of property ownership. You couldn't sell it outside of your family. Now the Sadducees tried to trick Jesus, if you remember, with this very question that's recorded in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They tried to trick him with the question of someone dies and the next brother remarries the widow, and then the next brother and the next brother, and all 7 of them die and remain childless. Whose will she be in the resurrection? They were trying to trick him with this very principle. But since in this case there were no more brothers and no prospects for more, Naomi insisted that the 2 young women seek marriage in their own homeland. In events in chapter 4 kind of imply that it became customary for the kinsman redeemer, in addition to redeeming property, to also to marry the widow in fulfillment of the heirship requirements. But he didn't marry Naomi in this instance. He married Ruth, or will marry Ruth. Naomi's comment to God, Yahweh, is how it is translated. He had not stopped showing kindness to the dead, in verse 20, may indicate she already had hopes that Boaz would fulfill his duties as a kinsman and redeemer and preserve the line of Elimelech and Mahlon. This must have been a very good day, though, because they started the day with worrying about where they were going to get their food just for that day. It's hard for us to imagine starting a day wondering where you're going to get food sufficient to sustain you for that day. And not only that, but they were blessed beyond what Ruth actually was able to do on her own. And not only that, she was treated kindly. And not only that, she was given the opportunity to stay in Boaz's fields through the wheat harvest, which would take her almost up to the 1st of June. And although she continued to work and she continued to glean in the field, she still lived with Naomi. She's still taking care of her mother-in-law. Some modern narrators or commentators are skeptical of Ruth and her motives, but her motives are clear as day. She could have left at any time. She could have stayed there in Moab, but she didn't. In general, Hebrew narratives don't employ characters with ulterior motives, with unexposed agendas that the reader can't see. Ordinary people are very transparent, moving in and out of this very difficult life, and they're doing it in an exemplary fashion. So we have Boaz, the local farmer, Naomi, the bereaved widow, daughter-in-law and with her that recently returned, and they're all behaving in a way worthy of emulation. They're all above board. They're all being kind to each other. Any one of them in this process could have just became completely aloof and say, I'm done with this. Naomi could have said to you, stay out of here. Go home. I don't want you here anymore. Boaz could have run Ruth off. Any of those things, but they didn't. They didn't. They live and behave in a manner worthy of emulation. And that's important when you get into chapter 3. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, my daughter, I must find you a home. I must find a home or you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley in the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes, and then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you're there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and then he will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor, did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. And when Boaz finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I'm your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are my guardian or kinsman redeemer. Or since you are the kinsman redeemer of our family. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. Again, that description, my daughter. And notice in verse 9, Ruth says, our family. So she's fully invested in this family, even though she is only related through marriage, a marriage now that is no longer in effect because she's widowed. But the Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. The kindness is greater than what you showed earlier. You've not run after younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I'll do for you all you ask. All the people in my town know that you are a woman of noble character. And although it is true that I am the guardian redeemer, kinsman redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until the morning. So she lay at his feet until morning. She got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. But he said, bring me a shawl that you are wearing and hold it out. And he did. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. And then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi, she asked, how did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for this man will not rest until this matter is settled today. It's kind of an odd courtship if you look at it. It's almost as if Ruth is proposing to Boaz. After 7 weeks of barley and wheat harvests, Naomi's deciding to take the initiative. And she has Ruth's best interests in mind. She wants Ruth to have a home. She wants Ruth to be taken care of. After Naomi's old age and death, Ruth would be even more unprotected. She'd be even more powerless than she is. So she expresses her desire for Ruth to have a home, someone to take care of her and provide for her. So the season of the harvest is ending, and Boaz would be spending the night on the threshing floor, away from the crowded city. Time seemed appropriate for Ruth to make her request for marriage. The threshing floor was an area where grain was crushed and torn to separate the chaff and the straw and the grains. They would crush it and then they'd throw it up in the air, and the wind would blow away the chaff. The grains would fall back down to the ground. All this took place in the spring during the harvest festivals. But the almost secrecy of Ruth's mission, the privacy at the far end of the grain pile, the darkness of midnight, the early dawn when this encounter takes place, the danger of being discovered, all this kind of lends to a sense of anticipation and suspense. But notice, nothing untoward takes place. They're still acting above board. They're still acting in a way of kindness and blessing, but appropriately. Naomi had encouraged Ruth to look her best, to secretly observe Boaz's actions, see where he goes, and Ruth was to uncover his feet and lie down. Now, we don't know the full significance. Many explanations are offered. Most plausible is probably that this was a sign of humility. Some believe it was just a matter of exposing his feet to the cold so that would awaken Boaz so that he would notice her. Probably it was a sign of humility, a petition. Hear my petition. She was not to lie down by his side. She was to lie down at his feet. To lie down by his side would be immodest. But at his feet, that's the posture of a humble petitioner. If Ruth had acted in any other respect other than the way she did, it would have been judged as indecent or immodest, and most likely would have displeased an honorable man such as Boaz. But he's pleased with the way she's approached him. And what she did seems almost scandalous if you think about it. She's going into the middle of the night into an area where women usually were not allowed. And she's being bold to approach this man and ask him to redeem her, basically to marry her. But Naomi and Ruth and even Boaz, they make sure we understand and know there were no sinful intentions here. This was completely above board, and this was part of the plan of God at work in this. It's kind of interesting, though, that this kind of parallels somewhat in 1 Kings chapter 1 when King David was very old. The Bible says he couldn't keep warm. Even when they put covers on him, they couldn't keep warm. And so the attendants said, well, we'll go find a young woman to serve and the king and take care of him, and she can lie beside him and keep him warm. But there was never any sinful or untoward intent. It's the same with Ruth. That was not her intent. Her intent was to be redeemed. So now this narrative is beginning to move toward a resolution. After this midnight visit, she's putting her reputation and expectations at risk. And she claims the protection of Boaz as a redeemer. Now, in today's society, we don't understand the full implications of Ruth's actions. In our culture, that's lost on us, basically. It's an ancient custom. I believe some areas in the Arab world, they still use this custom to propose marriage. But what's clear is that Boaz understood Ruth to be proposing marriage as a function of his duty as a kinsman redeemer. And this was a proposal of marriage referred to in Ezekiel chapter 16, as a matter of fact. But the symbolic language asserts that Ruth has found her security under the wings of God, the wings of God of Israel. And in essence, her request was to find further security under the wings of Boaz. So he's honored and surprised by Ruth's request for marriage. He assumed she would prefer a younger man. And he states that this kindness, or best translation is loyalty, is greater than her earlier expression, presumably referring to her faithfulness to Naomi. The implications is that Ruth is consistently given to her higher obligations of family loyalty above her personal well-being. She could have chosen to go back to her land. She could have chosen any number. She could have chosen a younger man, but Boaz says, no, you're chosen me. And so in a surprising twist, though, he tells Ruth, well, there's another man closer in relationship. He's first in line. He has the advantage. Boaz does, but his actions are exemplary. He could have short-circuited this, but he says, nope, there's someone else that's closer a relative than me. They have the right to redeem first. Again, acting admirably. And when Ruth returns, Naomi advises her, well, wait patiently, expect an answer. Boaz will not rest until this is resolved. Apparently, Naomi has great confidence in Boaz's character. And so the question becomes, is this coincidence or is this God's providence? They return during the barley harvest, which would lead to them not only be able to obtain the food they need to survive, but also to meet this man named Boaz, who is a redeemer. As it turned out, Ruth chooses the field owned by Boaz to glean in. She could have chosen, and she had no idea ahead of time who he was. She could have chosen any field, but she chose the one Boaz. The first in line to redeem, as we'll find out next week, he can't redeem. So then it passes to Boaz. At first he says, oh, yeah, I'll redeem it. But then when explained further what that would require, he says, no, I can't do it. Boaz was kind to Ruth, which was not very common. He protected her. He gave her water, gave her an extra meal at mealtime, gave her preferential harvesting, allowed her on the threshing floor, and accepted her proposal, so to speak. So confidence or providence. God is at work in this, and it's obviously God's providence. So next week we will conclude this 4-part series on the book of Ruth, and we will find out the divine purpose behind Ruth's original decision to follow Naomi and Naomi's God. The necessary arrangements are going to turn on a combination of heirship marriage, as we read about in Deuteronomy 25, and the laws of redeeming a relative from Leviticus 25. Ruth is taken as a wife, and her ancient blessings and fruitfulness will be invoked. And Naomi's bitterness will turn to joy, and her grandson will become the grandfather of King David. And in those events, the Lord's providence, up until now maybe somewhat hidden, will be revealed. So the marriage, the union of a Jew, Boaz, and a Gentile, Ruth, will result in a lineage that will produce the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And it is that Messiah and the death of him and his blood that he shed will result in the union of the Jew and the Gentile through the blood on the cross, reconciled to God through the death of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, whose lineage will come through all these providential actions that are taking place. The union of a Jew and a Gentile through the cross began with the union of a Jew and a Gentile through marriage. So next week we'll conclude. We'll go into chapter 4, and we will conclude this series. Thank you.